Welcome everyone to the Single Malt Strategy Podcast. I'm your host, Jean, the Strategy Wargamer, and I also am joined with my co-host, Eric TortugaPower, and we have a special episode for you guys today because we have a special guest. We have Alex, the project lead of Panzer Corps 2, the successful and incredible game that just got released. Welcome, Alex. How are you doing?
Hi, guys. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you today.
We're really glad to have you.
Yeah, welcome on the show. I've been wanting to do this for, I would say, probably over a year now, because ever since you guys announced Panzer Corps 2, I was like, oh, I gotta I gotta have him on the show. So yeah, it's since you have announced the game and since you released the game, I was just enthused and just been really excited to have you on the show. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, it's really a great opportunity because ever since the release, I wanted to have some Q&A session with the fans, but I never got around to it because of all those technical issues, things like that. After release, it was crazy period. So hopefully today I can answer everything which is on people's minds.
What we're going to do, we're going to actually do a special kind of episode because this is the first time we're going to do this. I've kind of reached out on the forums to see if fans had any questions. So I'm going to kind of leave that toward the end because I want my questions to be first because these are the questions I've been itching to ask since you announced Panzer Corps 2. So, but before we dive into that, I want to kind of ask some questions about you. Like, what were your favorite strategy games growing up? Because these are kind of like the games that influenced you, I guess, to go into the strategy gaming industry. So, So what were your favorite strategy games growing up? What were the kind of games that left an impression on you?
Right. So in truth, most games which I played quite a long time ago when I was in school and university, those times. And I often had some thoughts like, okay, I would do this thing differently, but I never thought I would become a game developer. It was a total accident. Maybe we can talk about it a bit later. But the most memorable games are probably the same games which all other people playing strategies remember, games from 90s. Well, obviously, 5-star General series, Panzer General, and its spin-offs like Fantasy General, whatever. Then, of course, games like Civilization, XCOM, Master of Magic, Master of Orion, first and second. What else? Heroes of Might and Magic, first 3. So those were the most memorable. And there were some RTS as well. So Dune 2, Warcraft, Starcraft. But for me it was always a little bit too stressful to play in real time. So Turnbased I liked a bit more.
Yeah, I some of those games that you mentioned changed my life, like Panzer General, and I'm assuming Panzer General had a big influence on the development of Panzer Corps.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, I once I first heard that you guys first announced, this is years back when you first announced Panzer Corps, it I remember literally it made my day because I'm like, wait a minute, this looks a lot like Panzer General but modernized, and I literally almost fell off my chair because this is like a dream come true. I was a big Panzer General fan, and then they came out with Panzer General, and then I think a whole slew of other titles, like I think Pacific General, something like that. That was another one that I played a lot.
Yeah.
And I think People. Correct me if I'm wrong. It was People's General. I think they came out after that.
It was after Panzer General 2. It used the same engine. So it was end of 90s, probably 99, something like that.
What inspired you to devote your career to making strategy games? What was that kind of like, you mentioned that accident that got you into the industry. So what was that thing that made you jump into the industry?
Yeah, right. So I was always a professional software developer, and I was actually working in a company which was making software for. It was not smartphones back then; it was PDAs, so handheld devices, and
Oh, wow.
it was very boring actually, like financial accounting software, some calendar, that kind of stuff. So super boring. And in part because I was bored on my primary job, I started doing like a little game, and I didn't really want to create a game. What I wanted, I was interested in trying to do some AI programming, and I just needed some engine, some like game, and I could create some AI for it. And I chose to create a remake of Panzer General simply because it was such a simple game. Compared to others like Civilization, it was actually super simple. Just one view mode, just the map and units, no complex rules, stuff like that. And that's how I started creating Panzer General Remake, which was eventually called Panzer General Forever, that project.
Oh, wow.
And basically, it took a couple of years of working like part-time in the evenings, stuff like that. But eventually, it got a quite good playable state. So I released it as a freeware project on the internet. And this project was noticed by Ian, head of Slitherine, and he reached out to me and asked if I wanted to do like a commercial version of this. And I never thought about it because I thought it was a super niche game and no one wanted to play it anymore. There was no commercial potential, stuff like that. But Ian thought differently, so he invited me, and that's how it all started, right? If it was not for him, I would never do it. That's why I said it was a pure accident.
Wow, that's incredible. I know Ian's an incredible person,
Oh,
and so it. That's another thing I have to thank him for because he started this entire thing. So this is incredible. I mean, we wouldn't have Panzer Corps 2 or Panzer Corps 1 for that matter without Ian. Wow, that's incredible.
Exactly.
Wow. So I'm kind of curious. Let's dive in to Panzer Corps 2 because I've been itching to ask a whole slew of questions about Panzer Corps 2 because I didn't, to be honest, I didn't think you can top Panzer Corps 1. So when you guys announced Panzer Corps 2, I was just like, wait. And then I saw the images and I'm like, wow, this is kind of like Panzer Corps 1 on steroids. And there was a whole bunch of mechanics that you changed too, which just kind of made me fall off my seat again. But how long did it take to develop Panzer Corps 2? Like, when did you start, and how long was that process?
Yeah, so it was a huge project, actually. It's the biggest project I ever did, right? And in the end, it took me more time than graduating from my university, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, and maybe if I knew in the beginning how long it would take, maybe I would not dare to start it. Because I was thinking, okay, so we have Panzer Corps 1, I did it, the code myself, and now we wanted to do like the same game just with 3D. So it's not a big deal, it's easy. But then we were adding more and more stuff, like we were adding full-blown undo engine, and we were adding lore scripting, and we were adding random maps, and we were adding online multiplayer and simultaneous co-op mode, and every single thing took more and more and more time. So you asked how long it took, and a main phase of development took 5 years, actually.
Wow.
It took even longer if you consider that I started collecting ideas, plans, whatever, ever since the release of original game, Panzer Corps 1, but a main phase of development took 5 years. So, like I said, it was a huge project for our small team. and it's a small miracle that we finished it in the end. So,
wow, so around 2015, roughly.
yeah, I think so. So we released another game between the two Panzer Corps installments. It was Warhammer 40k Armageddon, and I think it released in 2014. And shortly after that, maybe a year later, after that game, we switched to Panzer Corps 2. So,
how big is the development team on this then? How many people do you have who have worked on Panzer Corps 2?
Mm-hmm. Right, so the core team which was working like all this time or most of this time, so it's myself, and I am like part-time game designer and part-time programmer. Then we had two more people doing the code, and then we had our art director, creative director, who was actually from Slitherine. It's Pat, and he is absolutely amazing. And this was our core team. So later, when we had engine running, we had the editor tools. Also, we had our main campaign designer, Krashimir, who did like 60 scenarios for the main campaign, plus a few extras, and he also was responsible for the whole unit file. We have like 1,000 of units in this game, and every unit has like maybe 20 different parameters, so it's 20,000 of numbers which had to be configured, and it was also done by Krashimir. So he is also, I would say, a part of the core team, even though he obviously started working later because there was nothing to work with in the beginning for him. So these are our team, 5 people, and all the rest. Well, it's a bit tricky, right? Because, for example, if you look at 3D models, there are several hundred of them, and it was a huge task to produce them. It took more than 2 years, and I think more than 10 people were doing them, but they were outsourced, so they were contracted to produce these models. So probably they cannot be called core team, but obviously they did huge amount of work as well.
Yeah, when you first said 5 people, without mentioning the art yet, I was thinking this game looks like way too good for only 5 people. How did they do it?
Yeah,
outsourcing some arts, that makes sense.
Yeah, but like I said, Patrick, art director, he is really great, and besides the units, most of the things which you see in the game is his work, like all-terrain graphics. It's just him, one person, and then also most of the UI and other things which we have. So he did not produce 2D art, that image which you see in the main menu, for example. It was also outsourced, but a lot of graphics was actually like one person job. So I'm amazed myself how fast he can do this art stuff. So
I kind of identify with Tortuga, side with Tortuga, because when you said 5 people, I was like, wow. But even like without the art, that is a lot, because you added tons of new mechanics into Panzer Corps 2, and I was just surprised that you guys did all that with only 5 people.
Mm-hmm. But that's exactly the reason why it took so long, right? Because I think if you count everything, like Panzer General Forever project, which became a part of Panzer Corps code base, but that game was done by myself, I mean the code, and I think it took like 2 years. So the reason why Panzer Corps 2 took much more is exactly because we were adding all those features. And in retrospect, maybe we were too ambitious, maybe we should have put off some things for later, but we just promised people that all these features would be in the game. We made some announcements, some dev diaries, whatever, and I just felt we need to deliver upon all those promises, so we only released when most of the things were done. That's why it took a lot of time. And people were waiting for a long time, right? We announced a couple of years ago already. Time flies, so...
Yeah, the kind of highlights of my week were looking at those dev diaries that you guys had, because every time you guys released it, I was like, wait a minute, you can do this and you can do this. I think the biggest one that kind of left a mark was, I had to say, was the changes to the Air Force. Because like before, I think in Panzer Corps 1, you can move the Air Force anywhere and they just stay put. But in this one, you have to kind of like, you have to transfer them to different air bases. Like if you move forward, 100 miles with your troops, right? The planes are not just static in the air. They're like, hey, we're following you guys along. No, they have to go back to the air base. And so I really like that. So when I play the game, the first thing I look for is air bases where they are on the map, because you definitely need air support, when you're fighting war, especially with Blitzkrieg. So it kind of changed the way I play the game. So that dev diary, when you guys announced that was probably one of the most shocking.
Okay.
One of the questions I had was, what challenges did you face developing Panzer Corps 2? Which was like the biggest challenge in terms of development?
Well, it's hard to single out a single challenge, right? So one challenge, and maybe the biggest one, was, like I said, the sheer scope of the project. And everyone in the team felt like he was doing a lot of different things. But it was interesting at the same time. And in this game, I even, for the first time, tested myself as a composer. I created a lot of music for this game, and it was super interesting. But of course, it was a challenge to cope with all the tasks. So second challenge was to cope with Unreal Engine. It was a big challenge, actually, because Unreal, it was the first time we created a game in 3D. It was very new to us. And also Unreal is a very big engine, and it's intended primarily for bigger teams, huge studios. And it's a very heavy engine, even for your hardware. To compile your game, it takes several minutes, up to 10 minutes on weak hardware, and it also dramatically increases your development time, how fast you can iterate. Like, you run the game, you see an issue, you fix it, and you wait 10 minutes before you can test what you fixed. So it was another huge challenge for us. And also, there were some new features which were interesting. For example, random maps. We never did them before. And random maps, the problem with this feature is that it's very hard to write a spec which another person can act upon, right? You need to generate map which is looks realistic and is interesting to play on and whatever, but how do you define what's interesting to play, right? It's very hard, and in the end I had to do it myself. I tried to give this task to a different person, but just because I could not formalize this task well enough, in the end I just had to handle it myself to make sure it matched what I had in mind for this feature. So there was a lot of challenges, and also obviously some risks. We did not know if our player community would accept shift to 3D, for example. So we were taking some risks there, but it looks like they worked in the end, so that's nice.
What engine did you use for Panzer Corps 1?
Panzer Corps 1, like I said, it was a hobby project. I was doing it in spare time, and in order to do it, to finish it, I had to rely on technologies which I was familiar with from my day job. And that's the reason why it was written on Windows API, because that's what I was working with. And it created a lot of problems for us. because it was not cross-platform, obviously, and when we had to port it to iPad, for example, obviously iPad is not compatible with Windows. It's Apple. It's, yeah. So we actually had to rewrite the game from scratch for iPad, and it was...
wow.
Yeah, it took almost a year, as far as I remember. It was a big project to port it. So definitely we did not want to repeat this mistake. Well, it was not a mistake, it was just how things worked out. But for the sequel, definitely we needed an industry standard engine, which was cross-platform, which was intended for games, not anything else.
Why did you guys choose the Unreal Engine for Panzer Corps 2?
So basically, there are not so many like first-grade 3D engines on the market, right? I would say that it's mostly down to Unity or Unreal, because many of the others are just like quite old and not maintained anymore, or just they're too small. And when the engine is not very popular, this means you don't have so much documentation, tutorial videos, information, like support in general sense, right? So it was down to Unity versus Unreal, and we picked Unreal simply because the whole team, we all were C++ guys. We did not do like .NET programming, C#, that thing. So in the end it was a personal choice, because Unity, in some respects, it might have been easier to use it. But it has its own problems as well, because I have been talking to fellow developers who work with Slitherine and who do games with Unity, and it also has lots of issues, so probably it's down to personal preference mostly. It definitely created some new challenges which we did not even expect, but it's like an industry standard engine for sure. It allows to do a lot of things. It has very powerful tools.
Yeah, that's a healthy dose of the development background. So I have some questions more related to gameplay. So you have already developed this Panzer Corps. I'm trying to take us back 5 years ago or so. Mm-hmm. You developed Panzer Corps 1, and now you're moving into Panzer Corps 2. What was like the main focus for, like what was the main gameplay feature you wanted to bring that was lacking in the first one? Was it just an effort to commercialize? Or how did you enter into the development of 2, having already had 1?
Mm-hmm. So, in general, if you look at Panzer Corps 1, it was we were quite conservative in our approach to game design. And some people liked it, actually, because they played, obviously, Panzer General games in 90s, and it was not very different from those. So it worked well in this regard, but also we were criticized that we were too conservative and it was a missed opportunity to innovate, add a little bit extra to the game, stuff like that. So when we started doing the sequel, I knew that we could not approach it in the same way, even though some people would prefer us just to leave gameplay alone, upgrade the graphics, add whatever new game modes, features, but just leave gameplay alone. But I just felt it was not going to work anymore. We needed to innovate a little bit and try to develop this subgenre a little bit. And there were a few design goals which drove all other decisions. So one goal was to improve replayability, give the player more options. And another consideration was just to give the player more tactical tools, because in Panzer Corps 1 it was more about you have a bigger tank, you are going to win over a smaller tank. There was no tactical tools to shift the situation in your favor when you were lacking in firepower department. So I was trying to give some more options, and that's main reason why, for example, encirclements appeared in the game. We wanted to give players an ability to win the battle in some cases even without fighting it, right? You just encircle the enemy, block the supply, and enemy units begin to weaken every turn, and in real gameplay it can be a huge game changer, like in multiplayer where players are closely matched. If you manage to encircle your opponent, it can be like it can turn the battle, the whole game in your favor. So this was one of the most important considerations, and this is a turn-based game, and we wanted to give it like slightly wider appeal, and that's why we tried to make it a very dynamic, a very fast-paced, for turn-based, obviously, and that's the reason why. Units do a lot of damage to each other. For example, you don't need 5 turns to like bring a single unit down, and the game is very dense. Actually, a lot of action happens on every single turn. You don't need to just wait and turn again and again before something interesting happens, and because of this, a lot of other changes were made, for example, related to how you load into transports and unload. In Panzer Corps 1, it could take like half of the scenario to embark your whole army on naval transports, for example. In the new game, you can do it in a single turn, and it looks small when you read it on the feature list, but it changes like dynamic of the game a lot, so it's quite significant. Then what else? Another consideration was that we really wanted to give every single unit in the game some like importance, some niche where it's going to be useful, because I mean, when you produce several hundred of models for your game, you want people to use them. You don't want them to like remain in purchase screen forever, but no one is going to buy them, stuff like that. And it's a very complex issue. It affected a lot of decisions related to how different unit classes behave, what abilities they have, like recon units, anti-tank units, anti-air units. So it was actually a major change, and judging by feedback, it actually worked. So we see that people are using much more different units and whole unit classes in this game. So there were many changes, but there were like a few core design goals which we were trying to achieve with the sequel. Does it answer your question, or?
Yeah, very well.
Okay.
I even wrote down, I was like, wait, they focused on replayability, more tactical tools. This is interesting. It's because, you know, you have a working game, and there's so many different ways people can go about implementing a sequel. Some people go change the entire flow of the game. Not many, but some people just do a graphics update, which it sounds like was even a consideration for you guys, but you opted to go for, you know, somewhere in the middle, it sounds like, the middle ground.
Yeah, that's correct, and we understood that we had to upgrade the graphics, but also we did not want the game to be like just a facelift, because Panzer Corps released in 2011, right? It's almost 10 years since then, and
I feel old. I remember when that came out. It felt like yesterday.
Yeah, so it's quite some time, and also we released so much content for Panzer Corps 1. It was like more than a dozen DLCs, I think, and total scenario count was close to 500, I think. So people played those rules to death, basically, and in the new game, definitely we needed to give a slightly different experience, because obviously it's a sequel, it needs to be familiar, it needs to be easy to pick up for veterans of the series, but also definitely we needed to create some new experience.
Talking about replayability, one thing that I really loved that you guys included with this game was a comprehensive scenario editor. And I feel like this is a huge addition to the game, because once you finish all the scenarios that the game shipped with, you can now go to the forum and actually just download user-created scenarios, which, definitely increases the amount of time and value of the game. One question that I had was, would it be possible to develop a scenario or for like a Pacific War in Panzer Corps 2, or do you feel like a Pacific War scenario would need its own game because the mechanics of that would be different than European theater?
Well, I think that the current engine, it should work for Pacific, definitely, because, even for Panzer Corps 1, there were several, I think, mods which implemented Pacific theater campaigns, and naval rules in Panzer Corps were slightly less advanced than in the sequel, for example, ships did not support each other in any meaningful way, and submarines could not switch between submerged and surface states and so on. So it was even more simplistic there, but still it worked reasonably well. I think people liked those campaigns. So I definitely think it's doable, and if you look at Pacific General as well, that old game we mentioned before, it was also quite similar. They did have some advanced rules related to special damage ships did to each other, damaging hull or propellers or turrets, whatever. It was an interesting twist, but it did not add much. So it's definitely possible. However, when we actually get to Pacific, I would like to give another look to naval rules in particular, because I wanted to do it since ever. I had this idea that Panzer Corps 2 should be 3 games in one. So you can play your land warfare, air warfare, and naval warfare completely on their own, and any of them would be interesting. But I think we are not quite there, and one reason is just naval warfare has a very small place in the German campaign. You literally don't have many scenarios which even have ships in them. And that's why during the beta, during testing, we didn't really test naval rules all that much. And it was never a priority because of that. So I definitely want to give it another look.
Would that require its own game, or is that something like a DLC can provide?
Yes, it's definitely a DLC level of content, because all rules which will be changed or added, they are not going to conflict with content which already exists. Only this content will become slightly more interesting to play as well. And it's not just about the Pacific, because I want to create, for example, a random map type which is more focused on naval warfare, maybe some single scenarios which could use similar approach. So I definitely see it all as part of the same series. And to be honest, I don't see us creating another a completely separate game for Second World War in the near future, simply because I think that the new engine has a lot of potential which we need to exploit, unlock, and we don't really need a whole new game.
That's amazing. I'm very excited. That really excites me, because it's basically one game to rule them all. So if I want to play European theater or Pacific theater, I could just do it with one game. That's amazing.
That's the plan, yeah.
But turn-based naval combat, that's always been a tricky one. It'll be interesting to see what you guys come up with. Just in my opinion, turn-based naval combat is extremely hard to get right, because it doesn't, I don't know. I've seen it implemented many times, and I rarely find it implemented well. It's just really tough.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. But that's why it's interesting. It's like another challenge, and it will be much easier to try to solve this challenge when the game itself is released. I don't need to worry about a lot of other things. But you are totally right. And one of the reasons is because terrain is very boring. Like, you cannot come up with a lot. Like shallow sea, deep sea, maybe some small islands, skerries, whatever. But that's it. What else can you do? So what I think about it is that when your terrain is not very inspiring, you need to make units themselves more sophisticated, give them more parameters, more traits, more everything. That's like, well, it's a pretty trivial idea, right? But we shall see. We shall see what happens, because there are several games out there in this subgenre which do naval stuff, and like you say, I don't think any of them was like 100% successful, but I think it can be done to a degree, right?
Because from the naval's perspective, it's really hard to get into the tactics of it in a turn-based, in my opinion. I mean, this is just something that I happen to look at a little bit more closely than probably your average wargamer. I mean, my wargaming experience has a slight naval bias to it. So, yeah,
really,
it's hard to think about. Yeah, it's hard to think about terms, you know, like a lot of people try to model individual ships, and then you have these tactical combats, these turn-based things, which are just individual ships fighting in other individual ships, which is kind of an anomaly in especially a World War II time frame where it's almost completely fleet on fleet.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's really about tactics of the formations and stuff like this, and it's very, I find it's extremely hard to capture that, especially because if I take my turn first, that usually means that my ships get to move completely independent of what your actions are. And in the naval chess battle, it's really all about that minute by minute reaction to the enemy. And obviously it has to be abstracted if it's a turn-based game. So I agree with you. It's a great challenge, and I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with.
Yeah, okay. I hope you will see soon enough. But like you say, it needs to be very abstracted, especially when you have combined scenarios where there are ships, but also there are land units and stuff like that. Because, I mean, in Panzer Corps, a single turn takes like 1 day, right? So when your naval battle takes several turns, you should not consider it literally. It's definitely very abstracted, or you just don't believe it. It doesn't make sense. So definitely players will need some, I don't know, suspension of disbelief to enjoy it, but still I think there is room to make it interesting tactically in terms of like pure gameplay value. And in the end, it's what matters, right? It needs to be interesting. It needs to give you some interesting choices, decisions. So that's what I'll try to provide in my implementation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm big into like I don't go too deep like Tortuga here. I'm very abstracted when it comes down to a Pacific War turn-based game. So like basically, if you basically made Pacific General in Panzer Corps 2, like that would make my day. That would make my year. You know, because I remember playing that, like, to this day, like, I still remember playing that. I visualized myself in front of that computer, you know, landing Marines and having air assets. To me, that was one of the hallmarks of my youth. You mentioned earlier that you ported Panzer Corps 1. I did not know that you had to redo the code. That was that I gotta say thank you for that, because I thought it was a simple port, but since you mentioned that it took quite a while to port it, thank you for that, because I've got so many not even hours, days and weeks of like, you know, hundreds of hours at this point into my iPad for Panzer Corps 1. And I love that you guys made it 64-bit, because I know Apple cut off the 32-bit apps. And I had Panzer Corps 1, and I was like, oh, I hope this is 64-bit. And I clicked on it after the 32-bit apocalypse, and it still works. So special thank you for that. So I can still play it today. So the question I have is, since the original Panzer Corps 1 was ported to iPad, would it be possible to do the same with the Panzer Corps 2 based, since it's built on the Unreal Engine?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, theoretically, it's possible because, like you say, the engine is cross-platform, and also our own code base is this time around 100% cross-platform. But we need to keep in mind that Unreal Engine is quite stressful for hardware, and our game also it's quite stressful because those high-resolution units with a lot of detail and terrain textures and stuff like that, obviously it comes at a price. It takes quite a lot of memory, especially on bigger scenarios where you have lots of different units on the screen at the same time. So it would definitely be a small challenge to pack the game into a tablet. But it's doable. Technically, it's doable. So the main question is, will the decision to move to this platform be made by Slitherine, the publisher? Because lately they were, as I understand, quite reluctant to put their games to iPad.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. By the way, Alex, just to let you know, Jean asked this question to every developer we interview, and THG, the historical gamer, Matthew and I, we both just roll our eyes. We don't care if these things go to iPad. So this is just one of the funny dynamics between Jean and historical gamer and myself, that Jean really likes things on iPad, but we don't care.
Well, it's okay, but I think that Panzer Corps 1 in particular, it worked great in this format. Moving units with your fingers, it was a good experience. UI worked reasonably well, and you even had a smooth zooming on iPad, which you did not have on the PC in Panzer Corps 1. So it worked pretty well there, and personally, I would love to provide more options to our players, but there are also a lot of problems, not just technical, which I mentioned, but also related to other things, like Apple banning certain games after you spend time doing them. And there are many questions from people. Maybe you will ask this question today, later, as well. The questions are, do we want to do more modern conflicts, like what happens nowadays? And if we do those, it would be even more risky with Apple, because it's a very sensitive topic, obviously, modern stuff. So, yeah, there are a lot of considerations, and at this point, I don't know what the decision will be. Maybe there will be other platforms first, not tablets, but, for example, consoles. I don't know. Right now we are concentrating on PC version, but technically it's cross-platform, and we are ready to port it where we are told, basically. So that's how things stand.
I'm one of those people that plays a lot of my games on the tablet, I guess. Mainly because I have a home desktop, and, I don't get a lot of time to go to my office and play games, but, when I have the little ones, I can have my iPad or my iPhone with me, and it's really awesome. I could just whip out, Panzer Corps 1, and while I'm watching the little one, while he's watching Mickey, I can actually do a couple of scenarios, which, I always love.
Uh-huh.
So I wanted to actually get your take on the App Store. So because it's changed a great deal from when you released Panzer Corps 1 on the iPad to today, I feel like me and Historical Gamer mentioned it, how the market has moved over and transformed to a free-to-play model, and with a lot of people preferring free-to-play versus paid apps. So I'm kind of curious, do you think, as a whole, strategy games like Panzer Corps 2 can work in this new model or this new market?
Well, we did think about it a little bit, but I concluded that my preference was to provide more classic package to people, because many of the players who play our games nowadays, they come from earlier. They played like games in 90s and stuff like that, and they really prefer to like pay once for their game and just have it everywhere without DRM, whatever. That's what I think those people prefer, and that's how I like it as well, because free-to-play, in my opinion, it's like a model used to like lure people into the game and then try to grab their money, So I would prefer to leave things as they are for now. But like you say, yeah, it's definitely a modern trend. A lot of games are moving in that direction. But I'm a very conservative game designer. Maybe some would call me retrograde a little bit. So,
Well, thanks for answering that. To go back to gameplay, so one of the things I noticed is that there is an issue of scaling that you have. Some maps are a little bit smaller, and then you have the Eastern Front. So like the Western versus Eastern Front, you had to deal with scaling up or scaling down scenarios. How did that work? How did you approach that, especially with wanting to balance things, accuracy, replayability? I mean, what was your approach going into knowing that you would deal with huge scenarios on the Eastern Front, but also smaller, more geographically limited maps on the Western one?
Yeah, well, in this regard, we like stayed true to traditions of this series, because in this series the scale was always flexible, and you could do like the whole country on one map, and in the next scenario you have like one big city taking the whole map. And it's a little bit abstract, of course, because we don't scale things like ranges of units, stuff like that. And I actually have an idea to experiment with it. Add some parameters, scaling parameters, like if you have urban battle, make your tanks shooting across several hexes, stuff like that. But so far, it's an idea for the future, and what you see in base campaign is that game rules, game mechanics, unit stats are always the same, no matter what scale the map has. So we definitely scale turns, like in one case your turn is a whole day or several days, and in another case one turn is 1 hour, and that explains why your tank can travel like several hundred kilometers in one turn on one map, and then on another map you can just travel, I don't know, several hundred meters. But if you approach it like a formula, it definitely feels a little bit weird. But if you just view it as an abstract game, then we find that it works reasonably well, simply because we like variety in our maps. Like, for example, urban battle, it feels very, very different to battle where you need to like capture a lot of ground, stuff like that. And we just like to intermix these things. We are doing it much more in Panzer Corps 2 compared to the original campaign of Panzer Corps 1, for example. So, yeah, the answer is we just make maps with different scale and don't change much else.
I have a couple of fan questions. If you don't mind, we could dive into that.
Absolutely.
So I have a user by the name of Mocha. He mentioned, will you do a grand campaign style DLC for the U.S. in the spirit of Panzer Corps 1 U.S. Corps?
Right. So it's an interesting question, because a grand campaign seems to be like the most popular campaign we made for Panzer Corps, at least judging by discussions on various forums. That's the campaign most mentioned by people. And we recognize this like kind of trend. So definitely the current thinking is that it would be nice to approach all major factions of Second World War in this format. I'm not saying it is going to be the only format, but definitely that's something we would like to explore. We did a lot of it in Panzer Corps. There was grant campaign for Germans and for USA, but it did not exist for Soviets, so it was an obvious gap in that content. And this time around, we hope to fill it. And also, speaking about Pacific Theater, it could also benefit from this approach. So, definitely, this is what we would like to do. And I would say at this point it's quite likely to happen because the game released, it was accepted reasonably well. It's going to be developed. It's clear now. So I can say that it's not going to happen this year, those campaigns for allies, but maybe next year already we will come up with something.
One fan wants to know, in the future, will there be a way to choose from a multitude of heroes rather than just getting a random one?
Well, it's quite a specific question, and there are many things which we can do with heroes, right? What we have now is like baseline, and one idea I have is maybe you can have a special commander trait which will allow you to choose between several options. I don't know how to call it, headhunter, talent hunter, whatever. So it's one option. Then definitely I can say that there will be historical heroes and heroes which you can acquire by using different things, like by fulfilling certain like side quests, secondary objectives, whatever. Like maybe you can rescue your hero from some place, whatever.
Oh, wow.
So definitely there is a lot we can do with heroes. We can also implement them like dying, getting wounded, getting imprisoned, so you need to rescue your favorite hero in next mission. There are a lot of ideas flying around, and definitely I'm going to expand this aspect. There is so much more we can do with heroes.
Maybe I can pipe in this question from the historical gamer. He wasn't able to join us, but he really, really wanted to. And he had kind of a specific question, which he shared by email. It was somehow this relationship between the Lord's Game Studio, who did Panzer Corps 1, and with Panzer Corps 2, they're not the same. That's not the studio that did Panzer Corps 2. Mm-hmm. What's the relation between them and Flashback Games? How was that worked out?
Right, so I have already explained how this series was developed and what was my role in it. So, as you remember, I was invited by Ian to work on Panzer Corps 1, and at that point I was just a single person. I did not have any studio, I didn't have any like brand name associated with myself. And Ian actually paired me with the Lost Game Studio. And we had a very clear separation of roles. So I was doing game design and I was doing all programming. And the Lots were responsible for all artwork, like media, whatever, sounds, music. And also, technically they were responsible for content design as well, but ultimately we ended up bringing in Kreshimir. He was my friend, and he helped me to do Panzer General Forever. He was testing it, playing it all the time, reported crazy amount of bugs. So in the end I invited him to work on content, and he also worked on content for Panzer Corps 2 this time around. So the Lots, they did all graphics, and it was a big task, obviously, because there are so many units in Panzer Corps, and I would like to say big thanks to the Lots, because like I said, nobody knew me back at the time, but somehow they believed in this project from the very beginning, and they invested all those resources we needed to make the full game. So that's how it worked. And then we collaborated with the Lots again on Armageddon. It was another joint project between myself. I already had Flashback Games brand name at that point. So it was another collaboration. And for Panzer Corps 2, I just felt that I already had enough like experience and resources and stuff like that to try and handle it on my own. But I did get some help from Slitherine. But this project was only Flashback Games this time around. And another thing which probably many people don't realize is that Lucas, who worked from the Lord's side on Panzer Corps, he went on to create his own studio, which created Order of Battle series. So
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That's really interesting.
So his studio, the Artistocrats, created that game. So basically, we worked together on Panzer Corps, and then I proceeded to create Panzer Corps 2, and he proceeded to create Order of Battle. So it's all very closely interconnected.
That's incredible.
That's funny because when we were talking about the naval stuff, one of the models in my head was Order of Battle. They've done a lot of naval stuff. Obviously, they had their American Pacific stuff.
Yeah, that's because they started from Pacific, so that task to create more sophisticated naval rules, for me, it's for the future, and for them, it was like the very first thing they needed to do. Yeah. And definitely that model is more sophisticated, and it has its problems, but also it has its fans, that's for sure. There are many people on the forums who like their system, so I'm not going to copy it. I don't like to look at other games when I'm thinking about this stuff, but at least some people definitely like how it works there, so...
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, I can see a lot of similarities. I mean, there's Order of Battle, Panzer Corps. I can see similarities, so I can tell where the inspiration came from.
Yeah, well, absolutely, but many games were inspired by the classic Panzer General series. I think there was like a gap when there were no games like that, and in some way Panzer Corps probably like rekindled interest in this genre. But if you look at like current time, there are quite a few games done which are similar. But I would say that Panzer Corps stays the closest to tradition. Like if you look at things like unit stats, some terrain traits, stuff like that. So Order of Battle definitely moved things in a slightly different direction. It's slightly more complex game. It has slightly more complex formulas, driving stuff. Where in Panzer Corps you have like binary rules, like closed terrain or open terrain. In Order of Battle you have percentages, you know, and some people like more complex stuff, obviously, especially like hardcore wargamers. They always want more complexity. All the complexity you can throw at them, they want it. And Panzer Corps tries to stay like simpler in terms of like rules and formulas and mechanics, because to be honest, it's still very difficult to play this game like well. When you like crank up difficulty, you instantly feel that you need to think very carefully about every move and stuff like that, and I just feel that the rules themselves can stay very simple. That's my approach. But
well, that was really insightful. I'm so glad that we got that last section out of you, because that was I'm now going to go back and think about it.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
So yeah, that's really awesome. I'm kind of one of those gamers that some days I like to play a simple game with great mechanics inside, and then other days I like going grognard and just loving to spend so much on even just working out the particulars of a single unit and such. So kind of like a best of both worlds kind of thing. So I have a couple of other fan questions, and I know we're going over an hour, so I'll just try to do another 2 or something like that. I have Roast Coffee. He says, will the game allow Italian or other Axis minor allies as purchasable? and retainable as core units?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the reason why you cannot buy like auxiliaries in the main campaign is that this campaign is just, it has such a huge scope. It starts in Poland, it ends in Berlin or maybe USA, whatever. And historically, Germans fought together with Italians, for example, only on a limited section of this big campaign, right? And we felt that it would be strange if you can purchase Italians and they would keep fighting with you till the very end. And that's the reason why it was switched off, because such feature exists in the game. You can enable it in any campaign. You can actually mod it into existing campaign. So it definitely exists, but that's the reason why we did not include it. However, this feedback, which mentions like Italians, for example, or other auxiliaries, it comes up quite often. A lot of people seem to want this. People who are more into history, who like to role play and relive historical events, for them it feels very odd when you just fight with Germans, when historically there were more nations fighting. And we acknowledge this a request from the fans. So I promise that we will think how we can integrate these guys into main campaign, and also definitely in the future campaigns you can expect to see more minor nations participating somehow. You can purchase their units and things like that. So it was actually a good feedback, because definitely when you work on a game for so long in isolations, you can lose sight of certain aspects, and this kind of feedback was very useful to remind us about certain things. So we'll see what we can do about it.
And then I have this is gonna be weird. A username by A432. He mentioned, could we get weather as an adjustable setting in multiplayer games? Is that possible?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. So when you look at random maps, right, it had to be a compromise. So on one hand, I wanted to give people more options, because I want this mode to be very varied, replayable, and stuff like that. But at the same time, I wanted to keep things simple, because I wanted people to fire up random maps in no time. And the way things work now, you can launch a random map without changing a single parameter. You can leave everything by default, click play, and you will get something meaningful. And if you want, you can change a few things, like year, nations involved, a type of mission, type of map. But I try to keep it super simple, because in many other games, when you try to play skirmish, you are overwhelmed by some UI where you need to choose your whole force, for example, and to launch a game is a job. You spend 10 minutes before you can even play anything. So that's a kind of compromise. And for this reason, I try to keep the number of settings to a minimum, and I'm not sure if advanced weather settings is a good idea to include. I will give it another thought, but I'm not sure about it. However, you can already do it, because you can generate random maps inside the game, but you can also generate random maps in the editor. And if you generate a random map in the editor, you can then adjust it any way you like. And weather in particular, it's just a couple of edit boxes which you need to change, and you will get any weather settings you want. So it's already possible. Just use the editor, and if you want to play it in multiplayer, you save this map into custom scenario folder, and if you want to play single player, you can just fire up the game from the editor directly. Just press play button and it will start. So And that's another reason why I'm not sure it needs to be in the game UI, because it's already doable, just in a different place.
That's awesome. I guarantee there's gonna be a lot of fans that are gonna be doing that. They're going right into the game right now and doing that. And I'll leave off with this last question. It's from Kerensky. He's actually content designer for Panzer Corps 2. And he says, after the game's successful release, was there any piece of feedback that you received that compelled you to attempt to improve a certain aspect of the game?
Yeah, well, I think it's a little bit odd question, because we are like reacting to feedback and improving things all the time. Because if you look at recent patches, like patch 3, for example, and the upcoming patch 4, it's already done. It's with Slitherine, so it will release shortly. If you look at those, they have like lots of small changes, and most of these changes were like directly inspired by people's requests and things like that. So definitely we are doing this a lot. However, I think what Kerensky meant with this question was, were there any like more dramatic shifts caused by user feedback, right? And I can think about a few such examples. So, for example, when we released the game, it had very little co-op content, because we just did not realize it was important enough. But the feedback which we got, and some of it was quite harsh, was that, like, are you kidding, guys? Where's co-op? It's just a couple of maps. We want more. We want more features. We want more content. And in response to this feedback, we are working on more maps for co-op mode, but also we enabled co-op in random maps, including free-for-all and other types like attack, defense, survival, whatever. And I can tell that it has become my favorite play mode now. Because on one hand you are playing with someone, it's much more fun than doing it on your own. But at the same time, when you are online with this person, you can make your turns simultaneously. So you are moving your units, he is or she is moving their units, and you don't wait at all. When you are like competitive, you take turns, and you spend a lot of time waiting. But in co-op, you don't wait. And it's just very interesting. Like, you take a huge map, 6 AI opponents, you need to crush them on in limited time. I don't know. For me, it's really interesting, and you can play with any nation in this mode. I played with like most significant nations in the game by this point, not just big ones like USA, USSR, Great Britain, but also Italy, Poland, Hungary. You get the idea. And it's just super interesting. You can investigate all kinds of unlikely alliances between factions, all kinds of strange maps which never existed, like islands, archipelago, whatever, you know. And yeah, it works really well, but if it was not for for this feedback, maybe we would not have it. So I think it's a very good example how user feedback helped us to improve a game in a very significant and noticeable way. And it happened quite fast after release as well. It's just 2 months after release, and we already have it, so it's great. And I just want to say that any feedback which our players have, I read everything which gets posted, at least on Steam and on Slitherine forums. So if you have any suggestions, just post, and there is a good chance that they will be implemented. We are always on lookout how improve things, make this game better. So,
wow, that's amazing. I really love that last part that you mentioned, that you read all the feedback and that you take that and try to implement that into the game. That's incredible.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very natural thing, but with big studios, it's not always the case, I think. So it's interesting that you like mention it because that's how it should be with game developers, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I never do because, like, you know, when a big game came out for, I don't know, let's say, you know, another studio, like a good example, like, let's say Red Dead Redemption 2, right? If you post something on the forums, there's a very good chance nobody's going to read it, especially not even a developer. And I love the fact that, you know, if you post on the Slitherine forums, you know, something you want added to the game or changed, that you read it, that's amazing. The project lead reads that. That's amazing.
Yeah, but that's also the benefit of working in this like smaller niche, because to be fair to big guys, they get so much feedback that I don't know, it's probably very difficult to read it all, but it's manageable even for one person in case of this like subgenre of turn-based war game. So it's just lucky. I think we have great community in general, and that's one of the reasons why I don't really look at like going to other genres, like, I don't know, shooters, things like that. I don't really want to go there, because I think our community is incredible. It's like real pleasure talking to these people, discussing like mechanics with them. So that's the benefit. We can never make as much money in this niche, but it's very rewarding, you know, to work on such games.
Yeah, and I mean, me as a fan and a fanatic of Slitherine and Matrix, that's exactly why I love all the developers and Slitherine and Matrix, because the passion and love that you guys exude is just it's incredible. Like, you know, there's so many games. Like, whenever I go on the computer and I get time to actually play a strategy game, you know, I go through my Slitherine and Matrix catalog. I'm like, geez, I don't know what the heck to do. There's so many amazing, incredible games here. I don't know which one to like choose from. Like, so it's it's really hard because and then it's really amazing because, you know, if I'm ever bored or if I ever have extra time, it's just I know what I can do with it, and I love that fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we are all very lucky to have Slytherin and Matrix, because, I mean, they did not exist like all the time, right? And there was time when this genre was very neglected, because
Oh yeah,
there was no specialist publisher working in this area. So it's really great that now we have this, and I had some opportunities to meet other developers, because Slytherin like arrange some events where we get together, and I can definitely confirm that all of these devs, they are very passionate about what they are doing. They are really great people. It's always a pleasure to meet them. So it's such a nice, you know, big family working on this. It's a really great feeling.
yeah. I really love the fact that I think one of the meetings, I think it was Paulo that mentioned it. But yeah, somebody from Matrix mentioned it to me that during one of these meetings, that's how the Battlestar Galactica game came out to be, because you had one dev there, and then they approached him and said, "Hey, would you guys be interested in doing a Battlestar Galactica?" And that's how the whole project came out to be. And without that meeting, we wouldn't have Battlestar Galactica Deadlock, and I'm a huge Battlestar Galactica fan. You know, I watched the 2004 series, or the early 2000 series, and I just, you know, yeah, I go crazy, and I love the fact that now I have a strategy game that I can just go into and just, you know, kind of role play a little bit.
Yeah, so that's another thing great about Slytherin, right? Because now we are getting, like, there was no Battlestar Galactica game before, right? And now we are also getting Starship Troopers, for example, and all kinds of stuff. It's amazing.
Yeah, that blew my mind. I'm kind of hoping that Slitherine and Matrix go for the my favorite IP, which is Star Trek, because
Okay.
you know, I I feel like, honestly, like that's a match made in heaven. You know, the best strategy game developer publisher out there with the best IP out there. That's a marriage made in heaven right there.
Yeah, well, I know nothing about it, but I can just say let's hope it happens
Yeah.
sometime.
Cross my fingers.
Yeah, fingers crossed for sure.
So thank you so much, Alex, for coming on the show and answering all these questions. You really got me super excited. I'm just like kind of blew my mind with some of the responses that you had, especially the iPad one where you spent a year on that. Special thank you for that, because right after this video, I'm going downstairs to watch the kids, and that's the game that I'm going to be firing up.
Yeah, thanks to you, because, this means the time spent was not wasted, right? So...
I appreciate it. So again, once again, thank you, and thank you for Slitherine and Paulo for setting all this up, and hopefully we can have you in the future come back on the show when you release a new DLC. We can get to talk about it.
Absolutely, I would be happy to come again and talk to you guys. It was a great pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me for this opportunity. And thanks to everyone who helped to arrange this meeting and to everyone listening. Thanks.
And that does it for episode 55, guys. We hope you guys enjoyed it, and we will catch you in the next one.